You are tuned to Radio Moscow. In addition to instructions earlier transmitted to stop construction work on installations in Cuba, the Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
That was Radio Moscow at 9 o'clock this morning. Mr. Khrushchev crating up his missiles and shipping them home. Rarely has any week in history ended in such an unexpected climax. We will have a look at that week. This is Ray Scherer, NBC News, Washington.
And this is NBC News. Presenting today an NBC News special, Crisis in Cuba, 7th day. Now, here is NBC News White House correspondent, Ray Scherer.
This is the week, these 7 days that shook the world. The United States almost went to nuclear war. Perhaps no one will ever know how close it came except for Nikita Khrushchev, who apparently had no illusions. The feeling in official Washington after one of the most frightening weeks in history is that it's too early for elation, but not too early to wonder what happened and why it happened. Moscow's course in the last 48 hours has seemed contradictory and zigzag, as if the Kremlin were having a great private debate. The I's are not dotted and the T's are not crossed, but everything seems easier. The mood here is still caution spelled with a capital C. Khrushchev has offered to remove his missiles from Cuba. If he does, we will call off the quarantine and there will be no invasion. The president today calls Khrushchev's decision statesmanlike. Has the United States made a deal with Moscow? The answer is no. What then is in this for Khrushchev? There will be no armed showdown. There will be no nuclear war. The Cuban problem will still be there for us, but Castro now stands before the world as the expendable man. Now to the news of the moment. First to White House correspondent Sandra Van Oker at the White House.
This is Sandra Van Oker, NBC News, reporting from the White House, where in just about a minute or two, reporters will be going into New Secretary Pierre Salinger's office to get the text of President Kennedy's latest letter to Premier Khrushchev. It's the letter that's expected to outline the details on the dismantling and the transfer of offensive weapons in Cuba. And now for the situation at the Defense Department, here's Peter Hackus at the Pentagon.
In brief, Ray, we're still taking aerial photos. We've seen no sign thus far that the Russians have stopped building those missile sites, and our military activity, including the blockade, is still on in full force. Until there's evidence that work has stopped and that the dismantling has begun, that's the way it will continue. Now, here's Ellie Abel, NBC State Department correspondent.
Secretary of State Rusk is prepared to go to New York to take personal charge of the negotiations with Russia's Kuznetsov and Uthant. The administration is taking nothing for granted at this moment. Reaching agreement on the fine print may be tricky, but there is hope now for political solutions through diplomacy, thanks to the President's show of determination backed by force. Now to Pauline Frederick, NBC News at the United Nations.
Secretary General Thant has just accepted Cuban Premier Castro's invitation to go to Havana to discuss the crisis. Thant leaves on Tuesday. He will take a staff with him, leaving some of the members behind when he returns to New York. Meanwhile, he's continuing his round of conferences here. He sees Soviet delegate Zorin in half an hour. For reaction in Moscow, here is NBC's Don Connery.
The Russian people have just heard the astonishing news on radio and television of major Soviet concessions to the United States. Today's decision, unquestionably, will be welcomed by the great mass of Russian people who have been fearful of war over Cuba, a war which the Soviet Union seems less ready to engage in than the United States. It means that Khrushchev is now thoroughly aware of the absolute determination of President Kennedy to act with force on the Cuban issue, and that any attempt of his to match American strength with Russian strength would mean disaster. Although a great loss of space for the Soviet Union is involved, Khrushchev may be able to retrieve something by now appearing to the world as a man of peace. But it is all at a tremendous cost to his standing in that part of the communist world dominated by Red China. This is Donald Connery, NBC News, Moscow.
Secretary General Thant, in writing to Castro that he was happy to go to Havana to discuss the crisis, said that he could appreciate the feeling that the unreserved respect for the sovereignty of Cuba is an essential prerequisite to any solution of the problem. He also said he hoped there could be a solution that would reassure other countries which have felt themselves threatened by recent developments in Cuba. For where all this leaves Fidel Castro, here is John Lavacek in Key West.
Soviet Premier Khrushchev's announcement that Russia will dismantle its missile bases in Cuba is the biggest blow to Castro's prestige since he took power almost 4 years ago. The Cuban premier loses whatever respect he still had in Latin America, and he loses prestige among his own people, who had been told that the Russians would not let him down. But Castro still has a face-saving out. His top lieutenants, like President Osvaldo Dorticos, have been saying publicly that Cuba is always ready to discuss differences with the United States, providing the two countries meet as equal sovereign states. This is John Lavacek, NBC News, Key West.
How the American show of strength looked to Allied capitals in just a minute. But first, this message.
This is Chet Huntley. Spread out around me are symbols of the pickup points with which NBC will cover the nation on election night. From these points and from Election Central in New York, we will gather and broadcast the returns using a new technique that will result in the greatest speed ever achieved in election reporting. Here is David Brinkley with information on the non-human side of NBC's coverage.
These represent some of the component parts of the RCA 501 computer. We will use its great speed to find trends in these running totals. We'll be sending this information back out to you as soon as you make it available to us. Chet, any predictions?
Well, David, I think we'd better wait until Tuesday, November 6th, when the returns come in.
Join us on the network More People Watch for News, NBC.
Coverage starts at 7 Eastern Time on this NBC station.
Well, just before today's sudden climax, what were Allied capitals saying about the United States' demonstration of willingness to defend its vital interests? We hear from London, Berlin, Tokyo, Rio, and Paris. First, NBC's chief European correspondent, Joseph C. Harsh.
The Cuba crisis, of course, inevitably produced another test of the strength of neutralism here in Britain. The result of this test, as of all previous such tests, was to expose neutralism as being weaker than most people had assumed. The neutralists were surprised and disappointed. The American embassy was surprised and delighted. Neutralism was able to mount one fairly rough demonstration, riot might be a more accurate word, in front of the American embassy here in London on the first night and scattered lesser affairs in other cities. But the top figures of the British government took a firm line of support for President Kennedy from the very first moment, and they never wavered. Most newspapers did waver on that first morning after, and then swung around steadily. By Friday, responsible and majority opinion in the country was seen to be firmly behind Washington. If one purpose of the exercise was to split the alliance, it failed spectacularly here in Britain. Joseph C. Harsh, NBC News, London.
To West Berliners who have lived in a state of tension for the last 17 years, the current crisis is just part of life in the divided city. Of all the friends and allies the Americans have around the world, none are firmer than the ordinary Berliners. If there is any criticism of President Kennedy and the American government, it is that they should have stood up to the Russians long ago. Again and again one hears the remark, there is only one thing the Russians understand, and that is force. As the days go by with nothing happening, the feeling there may be another blockade of Berlin is diminishing. But Berliners are taking no chances. Determined to stay put, they are laying away stores of non-perishable goods to make sure they will have enough if the city is cut off again. But there is no panic and certainly no despair. The city's nightlife is booming as hundreds of reporters who have flooded in find themselves with nothing to do but enjoy themselves. Russell Jones, NBC News, Berlin.
The Japanese government has taken a sympathetic attitude toward the American action on Cuba. Prime Minister Ikeda has written to President Kennedy saying that he considers the Soviet arming of Cuba with missiles a threat to security. It upsets the international balance, which so far, he says, has maintained peace. Mr. Ikeda says he strongly supports the United States position in the United Nations, and he has instructed his delegates to work with the Americans. One American diplomat here says the Japanese attitude is quite a mature reaction. Even the Japanese press, which likes to tie into the Americans at every provocation, this time has not been too critical. It's also significant, it seems to me, that the leftists here in Japan have been able to stir up only minor anti-American demonstrations. Overall, among the Japanese, there's an understanding of why we had to do it, coupled with a great fear of the possible consequences. This country is extremely sensitive because of its own familiarity with nuclear warfare. John Rich, NBC News, Tokyo.
Most Brazilians are having difficulty figuring out their government's attitude toward Castro and the Soviet arms. On the one hand, Brazil supports the U.S. naval blockade of Cuba. On the other hand, Brazil says she will never agree to any interference with Castro's government. Most Brazilian newspaper editorials criticize Brazil's attempt to be for the United States and for Cuba at the same time. The pro-Cuban Brazilians, a very loud minority, insist that Brazil condemn the U.S. naval blockade. This Brazil has not done. The anti-Castro Brazilians, mostly middle and upper-class businessmen, insist that Brazil helped to get rid of Castro as well as his Soviet arms. This Brazil will not do. Brazil's official position seems to be a pox and a pat on both your houses. This is Wilson Hall, NBC News, Rio de Janeiro.
Apart from the communists, whose reaction is predictable, and a certain starry-eyed group that believes that peace is best served by no action at all, France's reaction to the Cuban crisis has been generally sympathetic to the American position. Officially, the French government, led by President de Gaulle, while noting that it was merely informed but not consulted on President Kennedy's decision, has given the United States unusually sympathetic support. It understands and shares American concern about possible communist penetration into Latin America. Most French publications have applauded the American initiative, observing that for once it's the Russians who've been caught off balance. As for the ordinary Frenchman, many were shocked and concerned by the American move, worrying about the risk and consequences. Now that it appears to be working out effectively, both for peace in the West, Frenchmen are giving it more wholehearted support. This is Bernard Frizzell, NBC News, Paris.
We should like to append one footnote here. We do not have the benefit of Telstar today. Our overseas correspondents gave their reactions before today's sudden turn of events. NBC correspondents are still standing by at their various news beats. We hope now to explore the meaning of today's events with them. First to the White House. Sander Van Oker, what is the mood there? Relief, exuberance, caution? What would you call it?
Well, I don't know what you'd call it now, Ray. We went into the News Secretary Pierre Salinger's briefing in the interim between the beginning of the program and right now, expecting to get some specific details on how the United States and the Soviet Union will proceed toward the common end of removing offensive weapons from Cuba. And what we got was a text of a message from President Kennedy to Chairman Khrushchev, of which I think there are three main points. One, the President says he hopes the necessary measures can be taken at once through the UN. As your message says, that's Khrushchev's message. So the U.S. in turn will be able to remove the quarantine measures now in effect. And secondly, Khrushchev referred to an American plane violating Soviet airspace in eastern Siberia. The President says he's learned this plane, which was direct from Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska to the North Pole and return, did stray by navigational error off course. The pilot made an emergency call on open radio for navigational assistance and was guided back to his home base by the most direct route. Says the President, I regret this incident and will see to it that every precaution is taken to prevent reoccurrence. Now, the third point, the President seems to open up the opportunity, if Khrushchev wants to avail himself of it, to turn to other problems outstanding between the country. The President says, perhaps now, as we step back from danger, we can together make real progress in the vital field of disarmament. I think we should give priority to questions relating to the proliferation of nuclear weapons on Earth and in outer space, and to the great effort for a nuclear test ban. But we should also work hard to see if wider measures of disarmament can be agreed and put into operation at an early date. The United States government will be prepared to discuss these questions urgently and in a constructive spirit at Geneva or elsewhere. And that's the end of the note to Khrushchev.
Very good, Sandy. We've got to move on. And now let's swing across the river to the Pentagon. Peter Hackes, what about Khrushchev's sudden agreement to dismantle the bases? Has there been any let-up in United States military action?
Ray, I would say the picture here is that there hasn't been the slightest let-up. Our naval blockade is continuing to patrol the high seas around Cuba, although we are told that the flow of Russian ships toward Havana has become markedly different today. A Pentagon spokesman told us here that most of the Russian ships that were underway now have disappeared from sight. They must have changed course. Our aerial surveillance continues, and at the Pentagon we've just had the release of the picture of the U.S. Air Force pilot whose reconnaissance plane was lost over Cuba yesterday. He's Major Rudolph Anderson, 35 years old, of Greenville, South Carolina. No word on how his plane was lost or what kind it was. His father, however, is quoted on one of the wire services as having said that Major Anderson once took training as a U-2 pilot.
Peter, what about the situation at the moment? Are the Russians continuing to build sites? What do we know about that?
Well, they were, Ray, up until just a few hours ago. We've had no reports since the Khrushchev offer to dismantle the bases. Here at the Pentagon, another set of intelligence pictures was released today. Ballistic missile site at San Cristobal. 2 launch positions are ready for firing, with several buildings still under construction. Many vehicles show up in these pictures, and we're told that there's evidence here of intensive activity. Another picture taken at Sagua La Grande site 5 days ago. You'll notice a beautiful service road leading to the launch area, where you'll see a canvas-covered missile erector surrounded by other camouflage netting. There's enough equipment here now, we're told, to send ballistic missiles on flights toward the U.S. of up to 1,100 nautical miles. The intelligence people say this particular photo shows not only an intense effort to cover up the activity, but that the missiles are ready now at a moment's notice for firing. Another picture, also at Sagua La Grande, shows a low-level angled shot of a launch site. Those missile-ready buildings in the center rear of the picture are where the missiles and their warheads are housed and assembled. So you can see, Ray, the activity generally continues.
That's impressive, Pete. Thank you very much. To New York now, and United Nations correspondent Pauline Frederick.
Ray, I'm sorry I didn't hear your question, but perhaps I can anticipate it and suggest that the key role now in this crisis will be played by the little Burmese statesman who has an office here on the 38th floor, U Thant, the Secretary General. In accepting the invitation of Fidel Castro to go to Havana, one has to assume that he has the approval of the United States, and certainly Castro wouldn't have extended the invitation if it hadn't been approved in advance by the Soviet Union. Ambassador Stevenson saw Mr. Thant this morning undoubtedly to say that it would be all right for him to go to Havana, and negotiations will get underway possibly late Tuesday after Mr. Thant arrives. He will undoubtedly work out means for supervising verification that the bases are being dismantled and the weapons being withdrawn, as Khrushchev has promised they would be. And also, Thant has a much broader program of trying to negotiate the various issues that have brought this whole situation to such a state of crisis.
Thank you, Pauline. From the United Nations now to United States diplomacy. With me, NBC State Department correspondent Ellie Abel. Ellie, how close is this agreement to being certain?
Well, the feeling at the State Department seems to be that the Russians are quite serious. There was apparently a great debate within the Kremlin before this latest proposal this morning. The feeling is the Russians are now prepared to go ahead with serious negotiation. There is some encouragement at the decision in Moscow to send Kuznetsov to New York. Our people feel he's somewhat more adaptable, more flexible, perhaps, than Mr. Zorin, whose place he will be taking.
Why would Khrushchev suddenly do this after being so apparently confident all week? Why suddenly change position?
Well, it's very hard to read anybody's mind. It's hard for me. It's hard for the Secretary of State. I think the feeling here is that the Soviet Union, in the last few days, became very keenly aware of the determination of President Kennedy to see this thing through, and if necessary, to risk a nuclear war. I don't think that Mr. Khrushchev wants a nuclear war. I think Cuban waters are probably the place in which he would be least prepared to fight one. And so that, in effect, what did he get out of this? He was spared a war. I think all of us ought to be grateful for that.
What about Mr. Castro and his demand that we now get out of Guantanamo? Is that part of the arrangement?
It's a little hard to say, Ray. The feeling in our government is that Mr. Castro has rather been downrated throughout all these negotiations, and that it's a little hard to say how much voice he has left. It may be, however, and it should not be ruled out as a possibility, that once he feels, in effect, pushed out of the picture, he may make a certain amount of noise because he is the big loser in this whole proposition. We don't know.
What do you see as the big lesson of the week for United States diplomacy?
I would say that the important lesson of the past week has been that the President of the United States, who tried conciliation, tried to meet the Russians halfway in any number of crises over quite a long time, finally realized and took the action that was needed to back up our vital interest with the intention to use force if need be.
NBC correspondents and how they see the longer-range aspects of what happened in this frenetic week. In a moment, we will look into another confrontation, this one between a communist power and a country friendly to us. First, this message.
Sunday on NBC.
This is James Mason. To tell you about the story of a river whose waters tumble and roar over dams, through gorges, a river that flows quietly through the flatlands of desert and then spills gently into the Mediterranean. The famous and fabled River Nile. This is the greatest single stream on Earth that runs 1/6 of the circumference of the Earth, and yet a stream whose source was a mystery to man for 2,000 years. Pharaohs, Caesars, and kings searched in vain for the most important single source of the Nile. You'll discover it when you watch this fascinating and fabulous story, The River Nile.
The River Nile was written by Lou Haslam, who won an Emmy for Vincent van Gogh, a self-portrait. Don't miss The River Nile, narrated by James Mason, Sunday at 10, 9 Central Time, in color on NBC.
While we here in the United States focused, I suppose, 99% of our attention on the confrontation between Washington and Moscow over Cuba, the rest of the world this week was watching something that was more than a confrontation, an undeclared war between Communist China and India. From New Delhi, NBC India correspondent Wells Hangan reports on that situation.
India is relying on the U.S. 7th Fleet, Premier Khrushchev, and General Winter to stop the Chinese Communist armies now advancing into this country. The 7th Fleet is far away in the Formosa Strait, but it helps keep the Chinese from going all out to subjugate India. Premier Khrushchev's role is more doubtful, but Indian leaders, especially Defense Minister Krishna Menon, cling to the hope that the Soviet chieftain may be able to restrain or inhibit his bellicose Chinese allies. To avoid embarrassing the Russians, as the Indians put it, Prime Minister Nehru will not ask the UN to censure Peking, nor will he accept American arms aid. India's immediate hope is the Himalayan winter, due to set in shortly. Heavy snowfall and icy winds, it's hoped, will stabilize the front until next spring. By that time, India supposedly will be able to equip its 600,000-man army with modern weapons purchased from Britain and the United States on some sort of deferred payment or credit basis. India does not have the hard cash with which to import Western arms, and Nehru's version of non-alignment rules out taking straight military aid from the West. Nehru talks bravely of recovering our lost territory, but the best opinion here is that the Himalayan borderlands occupied by the Chinese in the last 10 years or overrun since last Saturday are gone for good. Nehru has appealed for a supreme national effort to repel the invaders, but he still has not asked the Chinese Communist Embassy in New Delhi to go home. The reaction of the Indian public to the Chinese attacks was actually stronger than anything that the Nehru government did. Tens of thousands of Indians volunteered their services for the army. Not many of these could be accepted, partially because so many were physically unfit, but more important because India does not have the military equipment with which to arm numbers of new volunteers. Elsewhere, citizens' committees were formed to inform the public about the course of events Blood was collected from volunteer donors. Funds were collected to buy blankets and candy and other amenities for the troops at the front. The reaction also extended to the holding of many public meetings. Opposition parties, of course, voiced strong criticism of the government at the same time as they appealed for national unity in the face of the Chinese threat. Nothing in the history of India in the last 15 years appears to have unified and excited the people to the extent that the Chinese communist attacks have. The peasantry, the illiterate majority, is still only vaguely aware of what is going on, but he may have underrated the feeling of outrage among Indian Army officers and the educated minority here who now realize how easily the Chinese can grab Indian territory. Wells Hangen, NBC News, New Delhi.
What now for India and China? Well, for one thing, India appears to be replacing her neutralism with stronger ties to the West. The Chinese expansion may broaden China's rift with Russia. Unless there are negotiations or winter holds down the fighting, the situation could still develop into a bigger war. We'll be back with a final word on the Cuban situation in a minute. First, this message.
Chet Huntley.
And David Brinkley, NBC News Election Central.
1962 may well be the most important off-year election in recent history. When the polls have closed, your job, of course, will have been accomplished, and ours just begun. On Tuesday, November 6th, we'll start bringing you the clear, quick, and accurate coverage you've come to expect of NBC News.
The way NBC gets the figures so fast is by being there, by having more than 1,000 people stationed across the country where the votes are cast. So, Election Day, look around your polling place. You may see an NBC election reporter.
And then Election Night, for the clearest, quickest, and most accurate coverage of the returns, look to the network more people watch for News NBC.
Coverage starts at 7 Eastern Time on this NBC station.
And so ends one of the most extraordinary weeks in American history. All during the week, hour by hour, the world seemed to be escalating toward nuclear war. Now, suddenly, it seems to be escalating toward peace. This suddenness is perplexing. How can things change so quickly? Does Mr. Khrushchev mean what he says? And what does he expect from us in return? If the president pulls it off, how will it affect the election a week from Tuesday? What are the lessons of this week? Some of the lessons may be long in coming. Certainly, it is too early to claim victory, but it may not be too early to note, once again, a nation has to be ready to go to war to maintain the peace. A number of times in the past 15 years, the United States has shown itself ready to risk war. There was Greece and Turkey in 1946, the Berlin blockade 2 years later, Korea in 1950, Lebanon in 1958. In each case, confronted with American power, the Soviet Union pulled back. Perhaps the most important result of the week is this. The danger of a miscalculation on the part of Moscow is reduced. The United States has shown it will fight to defend its vital interests. Ray Scherer, NBC News, Washington.
Edward M. Kennedy and George Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts will meet the press today on NBC Radio.